Welcome to Recurring Insight. It's the beginning of your upkeep, so it's time for another episode. I'm your host, Michael, and let's dive in. Today we've got another sweet guide, and this time we're looking at removal. We'll look at the best pieces of removal in the format, and talk about what decks currently run them, so you can best decide whether you want to run them in your own decks. A couple guidelines before we get into it. First of all, they need to make it into at least 2 decks on the database to be considered. Second of all, I'm ranking them based on how often they make it into decks that could run them. Finally, if it's primarily a combo piece that doubles as removal, I'm not going to talk about it. Now that that's out of the way, let's look at the auto includes. Removal is more situational than counterspells, so even though these are auto includes, they can be excluded if you have a good enough reason. Abrupt Decay and Assassin's Trophy are no-brainers. The can't be countered clause is a huge upgrade. Even though Assassin's Trophy ramps your opponent, the ability to hit any permanent tilts the scale in its favor. In some extremely proactive decks, however, ramping your opponents is reason enough to cut it. Chain of Vapor doesn't permanently deal with the issue, and it has the potential to immediately bite back, but it's 1 CMC, which is huge, and the sole reason to include it. However, in decks that plan to go long or have access to removal that permanently deals with things, it doesn't see as much play. It does have the added benefit of enabling you to build up Storm and mana if you have mana positive permanents. Gilded Drake lets you take advantage of your opponent's creatures for the small price of 2 mana and a decent amount of life when it inevitably swings at you for revenge. It really is only excluded from decks that plan on short games. For these decks, they care less about removing value engines and more about dealing with stacks pieces, which are often universal and don't care about who controls them. Pyroblast and Red Elemental Blast are counterspells, but they also serve as removal. If you happen to be tapped out, you can gank whatever blue permanent hits the field. If I'm being honest, they're used more often for stack interaction, but blue permanents are still common enough in cEDH that they're used as removal as well. Hullbreacher specifically comes to mind. As I've said in the video about counterspells, in general, Red Elemental Blast edges out Pyroblast as it has limited targets if you're redirecting it. However, in decks that care about Storm, Pyroblast doesn't require the target to be blue, which does give it an advantage. The next tier covers the removal that isn't an auto include, but still makes frequent appearances. At this tier, you need a reason to include it, versus a reason to exclude it. That being said, sometimes simply increasing the removal density is a valid reason. Cyclonic Rift has seen a slow decline in popularity for a couple reasons, but the largest one is its inability to target your own things. You can't use it to abuse Dockside, but its ability to function as a one-sided board wipe means it has potential in more controlling decks or decks that create large amounts of mana. Additionally, for decks that lack black or white, your options are limited. Snap is the exact opposite. It's an amazing tempo play that's perfect for abusing Dockside or getting a stacks piece out of the way so you can combo. Because of this, it finds a home in proactive decks and some of the faster mid-range decks. Winds of Rebuke isn't free like Snap, but it blanks top of deck tutors and fills your graveyard to fuel Breach. Nature's Claim is a bit more narrow, but it destroys rather than bounces. It is run in some disruptive decks with more colors, but it mostly sees play in decks that have limited colors. They're typically proactive decks that are preparing for stacks pieces or control decks that are looking to permanently put down problematic permanents. The same goes for Swords to Plowshares, actually. It mostly sees play in decks with 3 or less colors, both proactive and disruptive rather than mid-range. Toxic Deluge is the most popular board wipe, as it's also the cheapest. It's seen a lot in 1 and 2 color non-green decks. At 3 and 4 color decks, it's run in mostly non-green decks with commanders of 3 or more toughness. The only green decks it's run in are dedicated control decks or are helmed by aristocratic generals. This is the last tier before we get into the niche removal. This tier is defined by the removal being decent, but only being included to compensate for lacking access to colors with better answers. Pongify and Rapid Hybridization don't measure up to Swords to Plowshares, but they see play in mono blue and 2 color decks without access to black. Submerge is in a similar situation, mainly seeing play in 1 and 2 color decks. However, it's more meta dependent and is more geared towards Stormy decks, as it can remove a stacks piece without slowing you down. Unsubstantiate is curiously seen only in 3 to 5 color decks and only in decks running red. This is most likely due to its ability to abuse Dockside. With this, as well as the fact that it's a tempo play, leads to it being most popular in mid-range decks. Abrade is flexible enough to make it into even 4-color decks. It's seen in proactive, mid-range, and control decks, and it doesn't need any particular synergy to be run. However, it sees more play in non-green and non-black decks. Skyclave Apparition is less than ideal due to both the double white mana requirement and its sorcery speed nature, even though it can hit most permanents. It only sees play in decks with 3 or less colors that don't have access to black. Like Apparition, Beast Within only sees play in green decks with 3 or less that don't have access to white or black. Most of the decks also lack either red or blue, which shows that it's mainly used to increase interaction density. While Reclamation Sage is in a similar position, Force of Vigor sees play in even 5-color decks. However, Force is more popular in slower decks. Reclamation Sage has a body, so it's more abusable and theoretically has a higher ceiling, but Force of Vigor is much better in practice. Looking at the 2-color spells, we've got Drown in the Loch and Fire Covenant. They both see play in similar decks, namely controlling decks, which makes sense considering Drown in the Loch requires full graveyards and Fire Covenant requires a payment of life that doesn't incentivize ad nauseam, which is typically the best way for black decks to speed things up. It also sees play in some faster Rakdos decks, as well as Najeela to deal with blockers. Right, now we're on to the niche ones. These are the ones that see play in a deck that takes a specific strategy to the extreme, don't have access to better options, or have a specific synergy with a commander. Aether Spellbomb sees play in decks that care about recursion or artifacts, like Muldrotha or Urza. Blink of an Eye and Into the Royal are in the same position as they're essentially the same card. They're too expensive for temporary removal, and unlike Winds of Rebuke, the kicker payoff only matters if you're planning to go long. Brazen Borrower only makes it into Sig and Shulane. Sig cares about the 3 damage Brazen Borrower can deal, and Shulane cares about creatures. Reality Shift only makes it into controlling, mono blue decks. Repeal serves as a storm card that bounces a Cheerio and draws a card. Rushing River serves a similar purpose as Repeal, but is more expensive and has more potential. Snapback really only makes it into decks that care about casting spells, like Perun. Steel Enchantment is partially a meta call, but there's normally at least one enchantment you wouldn't mind having. Because it also costs double blue, it only makes it into mono blue and 2-color decks that plan to go long. Stern Dismissal is really scraping the bottom of the barrel, as it only hits creatures and enchantments. It also can't be used to abuse Dockside, so it doesn't make it into any red decks. It really only sees play in decks that care about dealing with creatures, like Yuriko removing blockers and Teferi removing attackers. The land destruction spells are pretty straightforward, only seeing play in dedicated stacks decks. Aura of Silence serves as stacks or removal, so, as you would expect, sees play in stacks decks. Despite the double white requirement, it does see play in even 4-color stacks decks. Disenchant and Fragmentize are very similar, seeing play in 1 and 2-color stacks decks. Despite Disenchant being run in more decks, I lean towards Fragmentize as being more powerful, as there aren't many artifacts or enchantments over 4 mana that see play. Heliod's Intervention sees play in both stacks and Turbo Naws decks, as you can remove multiple stacks pieces or pad your life total if you're desperate. Grasp of Fate only makes it in decks that have a specific synergy with it, like Brago and Zur. Dismember is efficient removal, as you can kill essentially any creature for 1 mana and 4 life. Due to its CMC, it mainly sees play in low-color decks that aren't Turbo Naws. Fatal Push requires some kind of sacrifice synergy, like Gitrog or Yawgmoth. Feed the Swarm also only sees play in 1 and 2-color decks. However, it does provide enchantment removal in black. Chaos Warp sees play in controlling red decks that have access to 2 or less colors. Lightning Bolt and Thunderclap also serve as cheap creature removal in low-color decks. That being said, Thunderclap sees play in even 3-color decks, as proactive decks can leverage it for removal without taking up any mana on the combo turn. Pyroclasm is the most popular of the board wipes, but Cinderclasm and Flamesweep see a decent amount of play as well. They're mainly used in disruptive decks like Curious Control that are looking to punish dorks. However, Rolling Earthquake and Sweltering Suns sees play in a different type of controlling deck that isn't looking to keep their commander on the field for long outside of the combo turn. Shatterskull Smashing is geared towards stacksy decks, as it is more expensive. It doesn't see play in decks with more colors, as even though it doubles as a land, it only taps for red. Caustic Caterpillar sees play in low color decks that have synergy with it, like Isan, who can fetch it, or Marin, who can reanimate it. Kenrith's transformation almost exclusively sees play in mono green decks that don't have access to better creature removal. However, Corval does run it, as worst comes to worst, it can always be used as sack fodder. Selvala and Marwyn can both generate insane amounts of mana and use Kogla as an outlet. Manglehorn makes it into Staxy green decks, as its removal and tempo on a body. Seal of Primordium, however, only sees play in decks that care about recursion. We've only got 3 multicolored and colorless cards here. Last Zone sees play in low color decks that won't be overly handicapped by using a land that only taps for a colorless. Oko is powerful, but ultimately self-defeating. You can remove a creature in a way that it can't be recast or reanimated, but you're likely going to be buffing it so it can swing at Oko. Because of this, it mainly makes it in decks that can defend it, like Tasigur and Iker Kram. Supreme Verdict is exclusively run in 2-color stacks decks due to its high CMC. That's the last tier I'm going to cover. I'll link the script in the description and have the cards that only make it into one deck listed. They only see play because it's the least bad card for the slot, or the commander can abuse it. Before we go, one card that's missing is Mystic Reflection. This video is already longer than I wanted it to be, so I'll talk about it at another time. And there we go, that about covers it. I hope you enjoyed watching and that this was helpful. Credit goes to Scryfall for the images. As I said before, I'll link the script in the description for easy reference, as will my Twitter and Insta if you want to hit me up there. Also, I want to thank everybody that subscribed. We broke over 500 subs this week, and it means a lot that you think the videos are worth your time. If you like the video, please like, share, and subscribe. I'm your host, Michael, and I'll see you at the beginning of your next upkeep for another episode of Recurring Insight.